May 10, 1940, 4:15 a.m. The Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael sat in darkness, its massive concrete walls silent against the pre-dawn sky. Inside, 1,200 Belgian soldiers slept or stood watch, confident in the impregnability of their position. The fortress was considered the most modern fortification in the world, a masterpiece of military engineering that guarded the bridges over the Albert Canal and the approaches to Belgium's heartland. German intelligence had studied it obsessively, German commanders had debated it endlessly, and the consensus among military experts across Europe was clear. Eben-Emael was impregnable, a direct assault would be suicide. Any attack would require weeks of siege warfare, thousands of casualties, and would give the Allies ample time to mobilise their defences. The Belgian High Command had bet their entire defensive strategy on this assumption. The French had planned their response to German invasion around it. The British believed it would buy crucial time for their expeditionary force to deploy. They were all catastrophically wrong. At precisely 4:25 a.m, as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Belgian sentries heard something strange. Not the rumble of tanks or the thunder of artillery, but a whisper of wind and fabric. They looked up into the twilight sky and saw shapes descending from the darkness. Silent, ghostly, impossible. 9 gliders, each carrying 10 men, were landing directly on top of the fortress. Within 11 minutes, 78 German engineers would accomplish what an entire army corps could not. They would neutralise the most modern fortress in Europe using weapons that most commanders had dismissed as theoretical curiosities. Shaped charges, hollow charge explosives that could burn through meters of reinforced concrete like a blowtorch through butter. The story of Eben-Emael is not just about one fortress or one battle. It is about the moment when military theorists discovered their assumptions about modern warfare were obsolete. When gliders, dismissed as training toys and reconnaissance novelties, became the delivery system for the most devastating commando raid in military history. And when a small group of engineers, led by a first lieutenant who had never seen combat, humiliated an entire nation's defence establishment in less time than it takes to eat breakfast. The fortress of Eben-Emael was built between 1931 and 1935 at a cost of 150 million Belgian francs, roughly $3 million in contemporary dollars, equivalent to over $60 million today. It was not designed as a traditional fort, but as an underground city of war. The complex covered nearly 200 acres, with the majority of its structure buried beneath 15 feet of earth and reinforced concrete. 2 massive casemates, Maastricht I and Maastricht II, housed 120mm guns capable of interdicting the Maas River and the vital bridges at Vroonhoven and Veldwezelt. 4 75mm gun positions could sweep the Albert Canal and the surrounding approaches. 16 machine gun emplacements covered every avenue of approach. 4 anti-aircraft positions protected against air attack. The garrison of 200 men had ammunition for months, water from deep wells, power from independent generators, and food stores for extended siege. The fort's design incorporated every lesson learned from World War I. The concrete casemates were proof against the heaviest artillery. The spacing of positions prevented single hits from disabling multiple weapons. Underground corridors connected all positions, allowing movement without exposure to fire. Ventilation systems protected against gas attack. Retractable steel cupolas allowed observation and fire while minimizing exposure. The Fortress Command believed they had created something unprecedented, a position that could hold indefinitely against any conventional assault and would require either nuclear weapons or months of siege to reduce. They were correct in this assessment. What they failed to imagine was an assault that was anything but conventional. The German military had been studying Eben-Emael since its construction. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed it repeatedly. Spies reported on its garrison and procedures. Intelligence officers collected Belgian newspapers and technical journals for any mention of the fort's capabilities. By 1939, the German General Staff had concluded what every other military analyst had. Eben-Emael could not be taken by conventional means. An assault across the Albert Canal would be massacred by the fortress guns. An airborne assault by parachute would be shot to pieces before troops could organise. A siege would take months and tie down forces needed for the drive into France. The bridges over the Albert Canal, vital for any rapid advance, would be demolished long before German forces could secure them. Full Gelb, The plan for the invasion of France and the Low Countries seemed to have an unsolvable problem at its very beginning. Then, in October 1939, a relatively unknown officer in the Luftwaffe Engineering Corps proposed something that seemed insane. Hauptmann Walter Koch suggested that the problem could be solved with gliders, explosives, and 78 men. His superior officers thought he was mad. The concept of military gliders was not new. The Germans had been experimenting with them since the Treaty of Versailles banned powered military aircraft. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Germany had developed a robust glider pilot training program, ostensibly for sport aviation, but actually to create a reserve of pilots who could transition to powered aircraft when rearmament began. The DFS-230, the glider Koch proposed to use, was a relatively simple machine. A fabric-covered steel tube frame 37 feet long with a wingspan of 72 feet, it could carry a pilot and 9 fully equipped soldiers. It had no engine, no weapons, no armour. It was towed to altitude by a powered aircraft, released and glided silently to its landing zone. The concept of using gliders for combat operations had been discussed theoretically, but never seriously attempted. The problem seemed insurmountable. Gliders could not manoeuvre once released. They could not abort if the landing zone was compromised. They could not defend themselves. The men inside were helpless passengers until landing. Landing itself was a barely controlled crash. Most importantly, gliders could only be used once. After landing, they were immobile, useless, abandoned. The idea of using such fragile, defenceless aircraft against the most modern fortress in Europe struck most officers as suicidal fantasy. Koch persisted. He presented his plan to Major General Kurt Student, commander of the 7th Flieger Division, Germany's airborne forces. Student himself, an innovator who had championed parachute infantry, saw the potential. The key to Koch's plan was not the gliders themselves, but what they would carry. Hollladung, hollow charge explosives. The physics of shaped charges had been understood since the 1880s, when American researcher Charles Monroe discovered that explosive charges with a cavity would focus their energy into a penetrating jet. However, the military applications had been largely ignored. Conventional explosives, while less efficient, worked well enough against most targets. The German military's interest in shaped charges began in the mid-1930s, when engineers realized that modern reinforced concrete fortifications were becoming proof against conventional demolitions. The Siegfried Line fortifications along the French border demonstrated that even massive explosive charges could not reliably penetrate modern military concrete. Research into shaped charges accelerated. By 1938, German engineers at the Westphalian Anhaltische Sprengstoff Company had developed practical hollow charge weapons. The principle was elegantly simple. A cone-shaped cavity lined with metal, typically copper, was placed in the front of an explosive charge. When the explosive detonated, the cavity focused the explosion into a superplastic jet of metal, travelling at up to 25,000 miles per hour. This jet could penetrate armour or concrete, far exceeding the capability of the same amount of conventional explosive. The penetration was not caused by the kinetic energy of the jet, though it was travelling at hypersonic speeds, but by the sustained high pressure that literally flowed the target material out of the way like a high-pressure water jet cutting through sand. The largest shaped charge developed for the Eben-Emael operation weighed 110 pounds and could penetrate over 10 feet of reinforced concrete. Smaller charges of 25 and 50 pounds could defeat lesser fortifications. These weapons had never been used in combat. Their effectiveness was known from testing, but whether they would work under battlefield conditions placed by soldiers under fire against actual fortifications was unknown. Koch proposed to land gliders directly on top of Eben-Emael under cover of darkness, allowing engineers to place shaped charges against the fortress's gun cupolas and casemates. The charges would penetrate the fortifications and neutralize them before the garrison could react. Simultaneously, 3 more glider forces would capture the bridges over the Albert Canal, preventing their demolition. The entire operation would take minutes. If it succeeded, the door to Belgium would be blown open. If it failed, 78 of Germany's best assault engineers would be dead or captured, and the gliders would be revealed as the useless toys their critics claimed. Hitler himself was briefed on the operation in November 1939. According to witnesses, he studied the model of Eben-Emael in silence for several minutes, then turned to Student and Koch. "This will work," Student replied. "If it does not, the entire assault force will be lost." Hitler nodded. "Do it. but absolute secrecy. If this operation is compromised, the invasion cannot proceed. The unit chosen for the mission was Sturmabteilung Koch, Assault Detachment Koch, a specially formed unit of volunteers drawn from the 1st Parachute Regiment and 7th Flieger Division. The men were engineers trained in demolitions, fortification assault and close-quarters combat. Their commander, Oberleutnant Rudolf Witzig, was 24 years old. He had never been in combat. Neither had any of his men. For 6 months, from November 1939 to May 1940, Sturmabteilung Koch trained in absolute secrecy. Near Hildesheim in central Germany, engineers constructed full-scale replicas of Eben-Emael's cupolas and casemates, using the same construction techniques as the Belgians. The assault teams practiced placing shaped charges hundreds of times, first in daylight, then in darkness, then under simulated fire. Glider pilots, drawn from the Luftwaffe's transport groups, practiced precision landings. The DFS 230 gliders were modified with a primitive air brake, a parachute that deployed on landing to bring the glider to a stop in as little as 60 feet. This allowed landing in confined spaces on top of the fortress itself. The training was brutally realistic. Live explosives were used. Men were injured. Several gliders were destroyed in landing accidents. Security was absolute. The men trained in a restricted zone, forbidden to leave or communicate with the outside world. They were told they were preparing for a mission against Czech fortifications. Not until April 1940 were they informed of their actual target. When Witzig finally briefed his men on Eben-Emael, showing them reconnaissance photos and architectural diagrams obtained by German intelligence, the reaction was mixed. Some were confident, others thought it was suicide. Feldwebel Helmut Wenzel, who would lead one of the assault teams, later recalled the moment. "We looked at the photographs of Eben-Emael and thought, this is impossible. The fortress is massive, we are 78 men, but then," Witzig explained about the hollow charges. He showed us the test results. The holes burned through concrete thicker than the fortress walls. He showed us the glider landing simulations, and we began to believe. Not because it was easy, but because it was so insane that the Belgians would never expect it. The operational plan divided the assault force into 4 groups. Granite, 11 gliders carrying 85 men under Witzig, would land on Eben-Emael itself. Concrete, 9 men in 1 glider, would seize the bridge at Frauenhoven. Steel, 92 men in 9 gliders, would take the bridge at Veldwezelt. Iron, 90 men in 9 gliders, would capture the bridge at Cannes. The gliders would be towed to 8,500 feet by Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft, released over German territory, and glide silently across the border into Belgium. The flight time from release to landing was estimated at 13 minutes. The Belgians would have no warning. Weather was critical. The operation required clear skies for navigation and sufficient darkness to conceal the gliders until the last possible moment. The attack was scheduled for dawn on May 10, 1940, the opening day of Fall Gelb, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. On May 9th, the assault teams boarded their gliders at 2 airfields near Cologne. The gliders of Granite Group were at Ostheim. The bridge assault teams were at Butzweiler Hof. The men were equipped unlike any combat troops before them. Each carried a standard rifle or submachine gun, but their primary weapons were the shaped charges. The 110-pound charges required 2 men to carry and position. Smaller charges could be handled by 1 man. Each team also carried flamethrowers, smoke grenades, and conventional explosives for clearing obstacles. They wore standard Luftwaffe uniforms with one addition, a bright yellow cloth triangle sewn to their sleeves and helmets. This identification marker would allow friendly aircraft to distinguish them from Belgian defenders. At 4:30 a.m. on May 10th, the Ju-52 tow planes began taking off, each pulling a single glider. The operation was beginning, then disaster struck. Witzig's glider, carrying the mission commander and essential command equipment, experienced a tow rope failure at 500 feet. The glider, unable to maintain altitude, made an emergency landing in a field near Cologne. Witzig and his team were stranded on the wrong side of the border as the rest of their assault force flew toward Belgium without them. The mission that had been planned in obsessive detail for 6 months had lost its commander before crossing into enemy territory. Feldwebel Wenzel, flying in another glider, had no way of knowing Witzig was down. None of the gliders had radios. Each team was on its own. At 4:15 a.m., the gliders were released over German territory. The tow planes turned back. The gliders continued forward in silence. Inside Eben-Emael, the Belgian garrison was at reduced alert. No intelligence suggested an imminent attack. Sentries walked their rounds. Most of the fortress crew slept. The night had been quiet. At 4:25 a.m., a Belgian sentry on the surface of the fortress heard something strange. A rushing sound, like wind through trees. He looked up and saw a large shape descending directly toward him. Before he could sound an alarm, the DFS-230 glider touched down on the grass-covered surface of the fortress with a sound like tearing fabric. The air brake deployed. The glider stopped. The door flew open and German engineers poured out. 8 more gliders landed within seconds, disgorging their teams across the fortress surface. The Belgians were caught in absolute confusion. Enemy soldiers were on top of the fortress, not climbing the walls, not assaulting from the perimeter, on top of it. Sentries fired wildly. Alarms began sounding inside the fortress. Machine gun positions traversed frantically, trying to find targets among the chaos. The German assault teams moved with practiced precision. Each team had specific targets, identified from months of study and rehearsal. Team 1, under Feldwebel Wenzel, sprinted toward Cupola Nord, a retractable steel observation dome. They carried a 110-pound shaped charge. Within 90 seconds of landing, they had positioned the charge against the cupola's base and retreated to cover. The charge detonated. The explosion was not particularly loud, more of a sharp crack than a roar, but the effect was catastrophic. The shaped charge jet, travelling at hypersonic speed, punched through the cupola's steel base and the concrete beneath. Inside the cupola, the effect was apocalyptic. The penetrating jet filled the confined space with superheated gas and fragmented metal. The 4-man crew died instantly. The cupola, its mechanism destroyed, collapsed into the fortress. Team 2 attacked Cupola Sud with the same result. Team 3 placed charges against Kasmet Maastricht 1. The 120mm guns, capable of destroying any bridge within miles, were sealed inside their concrete housing when the shaped charges burned through. The crews, trapped inside, were killed by blast and heat. Team 4 eliminated Kasmet Maastricht 2. Team 5 destroyed Block 2, a 75mm gun position. Within 15 minutes of landing, every major gun position on the fortress surface was neutralized. The Belgians, trapped in their underground corridors, could not reach the surface to counterattack. When they emerged from access hatches, they were met with machine gun fire and grenades. The fortress, designed to resist weeks of siege, was being systematically destroyed by 78 men in minutes. The shaped charges worked exactly as designed. Each detonation burned through concrete and steel that conventional explosives would barely scratch. Belgian defenders inside the fortress reported that the explosions sounded different from conventional weapons. Not the deep boom of artillery, but a sharp, focused crack followed by the screaming sound of the penetrating jet. Sergeant Frans Moonen, a Belgian gunner who survived, later described what happened when a shaped charge penetrated the casemate where he was stationed. There was a sound like a giant blowtorch. Then the wall exploded inward, not crumbled, exploded. A jet of fire and molten metal sprayed across the room. 3 men were cut in half. The gun was destroyed. Everything happened in less than a second. We couldn't fight back because we couldn't see the enemy. They were outside, placing their charges and disappearing. At 5:30 a.m., Oberleutnant Witzig finally arrived. After his glider had made an emergency landing, he commandeered a Ju-52, convinced the pilot to tow the glider back into the air, and flew to Belgium in a second attempt. He landed his glider on the fortress surface an hour after the initial assault. His men, operating without their commander, had already accomplished most of their objectives. Witzig immediately took command and organized the consolidation of the position. The most dangerous phase was beginning. The Belgian garrison, numbering over 1,000 men, remained alive and armed inside the fortress. German reinforcements, the ground forces that were supposed to relieve the glider troops, were still miles away, fighting through Belgian defences along the border. The 78 German engineers were isolated on top of an enemy fortress, surrounded by over 1,000 angry defenders and whatever Belgian reinforcements might arrive. The Belgians attempted several counterattacks. Squads of infantry emerged from access tunnels, trying to retake the surface. Each attack was repulsed by German machine gun fire and grenades. The Germans had the advantage of position and surprise, but they were outnumbered 15-1. If the Belgians mounted a coordinated assault, the Germans would be overwhelmed. Witzig's solution was audacious. Rather than wait passively for relief, he continued attacking. His teams placed shaped charges against every cupola, every casemate, every defensive position they could identify. The fortress was being demolished from the outside, piece by piece. At 8:30 a.m., Belgian artillery from nearby forts began bombarding Eben-Emael's surface, trying to dislodge the Germans. The German troops took cover in the wrecked Belgian positions they had just destroyed. The irony was perfect. They were sheltering inside the fortifications they had penetrated. Shells burst across the fortress surface, but the German casualties were light. The shaped charges had been so effective that the destroyed Belgian positions no longer had any military value. At 12:15 p.m., a Belgian infantry company launched a counterattack from outside the fortress, attempting to reach the surface and reinforce the garrison. They advanced across open ground toward the fortress walls. German machine gunners, positioned in the destroyed Belgian emplacements, opened fire. The Belgian attack collapsed under concentrated fire. Relief force retreated, leaving dozens of dead and wounded. At 7 p.m., 36 hours after the initial landing, German ground forces of the 51st Engineer Battalion finally reached Eben-Emael. They brought heavy weapons, ammunition and reinforcements. The glider troops, who had been holding the fortress surface for 15 hours against a garrison 50 times their size, were relieved. But the fortress still had not surrendered. The Belgian garrison, though blind and isolated, remained armed and defiant. The commander, Major Jean Jotron, knew the fortress was lost but believed his orders required him to hold out as long as possible. The Belgian king had commanded that Eben-Emael must never fall. Witzig, now reinforced and resupplied, continued his systematic destruction. Every remaining cupola was attacked with shaped charges. Smoke grenades were dropped into ventilation shafts. Flamethrowers were used against access hatches. The Germans were not trying to storm the fortress. They were making it uninhabitable. On May 11th at 12:30 p.m., after 32 hours of siege, Major Jotron surrendered. The fortress garrison, 200 men, marched out and into captivity. Belgian casualties were 23 killed and 59 wounded. German casualties from the glider assault were 6 killed and 20 wounded. The most modern fortress in the world had fallen in less than 2 days to a force 1/15 its size. While Granite Group was destroying Eben-Emael, the 3 bridge assault teams were executing their own missions with equal success. At Vroonhoven, the bridge over the Albert Canal was defended by a reinforced infantry platoon with machine guns and prepared demolition charges. The bridge could be blown at any moment if an attack was detected. At 4:30 a.m., one glider carrying 9 men landed directly beside the bridge. The Belgians, shocked by the sudden appearance of enemy troops, hesitated for critical seconds. The German team, led by Feldwebel Helmut Wenzel, charged the bridge. Belgian engineers reached for the demolition plunger. A German submachine gun burst killed them before they could trigger the charges. Within 3 minutes, the bridge was in German hands, intact. At Veldweselt, 9 gliders landed near the bridge. The assault was more difficult. Belgian defenders were more alert and opened fire immediately. A brief firefight erupted. German engineers stormed the bridge under fire, killing the demolition team and cutting the wires to the explosive charges. The bridge was captured intact, though German casualties were heavier, with 3 dead and several wounded. At Caen, the assault encountered unexpected problems. Several gliders landed off target due to navigation errors. The assault force was scattered. Belgian defenders had time to trigger the demolition charges. The bridge exploded, collapsing into the canal. The mission was a failure, but 2 out of 3 bridges were secured. By 6 a.m. on May 10th, German ground forces were pouring across the intact bridges at Vroonhoven and Veldweselt. The 4th Panzer Division crossed the Albert Canal without opposition and drove deep into Belgium. The entire Belgian defensive plan, predicated on holding the canal line for days or weeks, collapsed in hours. The strategic impact was immediate. The Belgian army, expecting to conduct a fighting retreat to prepared positions, found German armour already behind their defensive lines. The French First Army, moving north to reinforce Belgium, discovered that the Germans had already broken through and were advancing faster than the French could deploy. The British Expeditionary Force, landing at Channel ports, found that the situation was already catastrophic. Within 3 days, German forces had advanced over 60 miles into Belgium. Within a week, they had reached the French border. Within 2 weeks, they had trapped the entire Allied Northern Army group in a pocket that would culminate in the Dunkirk evacuation. The fall of Eben-Emael was not the sole cause of this disaster, but it was the critical trigger. By neutralising the fortress and capturing the bridges in the first hour of the invasion, the Germans had decapitated Belgian defences before the battle even began. The psychological impact was as devastating as the tactical. Belgian morale collapsed. If Eben-Emael, the symbol of Belgian defensive strength, could fall in a day, what could stop the Germans? French commanders, learning that the fortress had been taken by glider troops, initially refused to believe the reports. Gliders? The fortress fell to gliders? The British were equally incredulous. Air Ministry analysts studying the operation concluded that the Germans must have used some kind of superweapon, possibly nerve gas or atomic explosives. The truth that shaped charges and careful planning had done what thousands of troops and weeks of siege could not was almost more frightening than any superweapon. If fortifications could be defeated so easily, what defence was there? The architect of the operation, Kurt Student, was promoted to general and given command of expanding airborne forces. Walter Koch received the Knight's Cross. Rudolf Witzig, the young lieutenant who had led the assault, became one of Germany's most decorated soldiers. The 78 men of Assault Detachment Koch were lionized in German propaganda. They had achieved what seemed impossible, but the more significant impact was doctrinal. Every military in the world suddenly reassessed airborne operations and fortification design. The Swiss, whose defence strategy relied entirely on mountain fortresses, immediately began studying shaped charges and anti-glider defences. The French accelerated their anti-airborne measures, though too late to affect the 1940 campaign. The British began developing their own airborne forces, culminating in operations like the Pegasus Bridge Assault on D-Day, a direct descendant of Eben-Emael. The Americans, observing from neutrality, drew lessons that would inform their doctrine for the rest of the war. The shaped charge technology pioneered at Eben-Emael became the foundation for anti-tank warfare. The Panzerfaust, Panzerschreck and Bazooka all used hollow charge warheads. Modern anti-tank missiles, from the Tau to the Javelin, are direct descendants. The principle discovered in Westphalian laboratories in the 1930s remains the basis for defeating armour today. But perhaps the most important lesson was about assumption and innovation. The Belgian military had built Eben-Emael based on logical assumptions about how fortresses could be attacked. Those assumptions were correct given conventional warfare. But Koch and Witzig had not attacked conventionally. They had identified an asymmetric approach that bypassed the fortress's strengths and exploited a vulnerability that the designers had never imagined. Someone could land on top of it. This pattern would repeat throughout World War II. The Maginot Line, impregnable from the front, was bypassed. Singapore, impregnable from the sea, was attacked from the land. Pearl Harbor, thought safe due to distance, was struck by aircraft carriers. Each disaster resulted from assumptions about what was possible meeting an enemy willing to attempt the impossible. In 1980, a reunion was held in Belgium for survivors of the Eben-Emael battle, both German and Belgian. Rudolf Witzig, by then an elderly man, met Franz Moonen, the Belgian sergeant who had survived the shaped charge attack. They spoke through an interpreter about that morning 40 years earlier. Moonen asked the question that had haunted him for decades. How did you do it? How did you destroy in minutes what we thought would take months? Witzig's answer was simple. We did not attack the fortress. We attacked the myth. You believed it was impregnable, so you did not imagine what we would try. The fortress itself was strong. Your belief in it made it weak. The ruins of Eben-Emael still exist. The fortress is now a museum, and visitors can tour the destroyed casemates and cupolas. The damage from the shape charges is still visible. Perfectly round holes burned through meters of concrete and steel. Some of the holes have been left unrepaired as testament to what happened. Standing inside one of the casemates, looking at the holes where the shaped charges penetrated, the visitor confronts a truth about military power. The strongest defence is only as strong as the imagination of the attacker. The Belgians imagined conventional siege warfare and built accordingly. The Germans imagined gliders and shaped charges and attacked accordingly. The fortress that could not fall fell. In 11 minutes, 78 men with new weapons and old gliders had rewritten military doctrine and changed the course of history. The commanders who had laughed at the idea of using gliders against a modern fortress were not laughing on May 11, 1940. They were surrendering. The thunder of conventional artillery, which the fortress had been designed to withstand, had been replaced by the sharp crack of shaped charges, which it could not. And in that difference between what was expected and what occurred lay the difference between victory and defeat, between a successful defence and a catastrophic collapse, between a war that might have been won and a campaign that was lost in the first 30 minutes. Eben-Emael stands today as a monument to the danger of assumption, the power of innovation, and the eternal military truth that the impossible is merely the improbable that no one has attempted yet. The Germans attempted it. The fortress fell, and with it fell any remaining hope that static defences and conventional thinking could stop a determined enemy willing to think differently. The sky above Eben-Emael on that May morning had been empty, then suddenly full of silent gliders. The fortress, impregnable by design, was destroyed by imagination. And the course of the war, perhaps the course of the century, was altered by 78 men who believed that what everyone said could not be done was simply something that had not been tried. They tried. It worked. The bridge was theirs. The implications of Eben-Emael's fall rippled outward with a speed that matched the German advance. Within hours of the fortress's neutralization, Belgian High Command was receiving reports that seemed impossible. The fortress had not fallen after weeks of siege. It had been gutted in minutes by troops who arrived in fabric-covered gliders. The psychological shock paralyzed decision-making at the highest levels. King Leopold III, Belgium's monarch and commander-in-chief, had based his entire defensive strategy on a single assumption: that Eben-Emael would hold long enough for French and British forces to deploy into Belgium and establish a defensive line. The Belgian army's war plan, developed over years and rehearsed in countless exercises, required the fortress to buy time. Not weeks necessarily, but at least days. The Germans had given them minutes. At Belgian General Headquarters in Breendonk, the mood shifted from confidence to panic in the span of a single morning. General Raoul van Overstraeten, military advisor to the king, received the first reports at 5:30 a.m. A German glider assault on Eben-Emael. He dismissed it as confused intelligence. Gliders could not carry enough troops to threaten a fortress. By 6 a.m., the reports were more detailed. Multiple gliders had landed on the fortress itself. Explosions were reported. Gun positions were not responding. Van Overstraeten began to understand that something unprecedented was occurring. By 7 a.m., the fortress commander reported that most surface positions were destroyed, and he was under siege from forces already inside his perimeter. Van Overstraeten's response was telling. He asked how many Germans were involved. When told approximately 70 to 80 men, he refused to believe it. He assumed the number was wrong by at least a factor of 10. Surely 700 or 800 troops had assaulted the fortress. The truth, that fewer than 100 men had accomplished this, was beyond his capacity to accept. The French reaction was even more dramatic. General Maurice Gamelin, commander of all Allied forces, was executing Plan D, the deployment of French armies into Belgium to meet the German invasion. The plan assumed that Belgian forces would conduct a fighting retreat, buying time for the French to establish positions along the Dyle River. Eben-Emael was the anchor of this strategy. When Gamelin learned that the fortress had effectively fallen on the first day, he initially suspected the Belgians had sabotaged it themselves. The alternative, that German airborne forces had neutralized it so quickly, suggested capabilities that rendered French defensive planning obsolete. General Georges, commanding the northeast front, was more perceptive. He understood immediately what the fall of Eben-Emael meant. If the Germans could land troops behind fortifications, then the entire concept of linear defense was compromised. The Maginot Line, France's massive chain of fortresses along the German border, was suddenly vulnerable, not to frontal assault, which it could resist indefinitely, but to the same kind of asymmetric attack that had destroyed Eben-Emael. Georges recommended immediate anti-airborne measures. All French fortresses should be ringed with obstacles to prevent glider landings. Anti-aircraft weapons should be positioned to engage low-flying aircraft. Garrison forces should be trained in anti-airborne defense. The recommendations were sound, but they came too late. The German offensive was already underway, moving far too fast for new defensive measures to be implemented. The British response combined scepticism and alarm. Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, received intelligence reports about the glider assault with frank disbelief. The Royal Air Force had experimented with gliders for training purposes, but the idea of using them in combat operations struck most RAF officers as absurd. Gliders were training tools, not weapons. When British intelligence confirmed that the Germans had indeed used gliders to capture Eben-Emael and the canal bridges, Dowding ordered an immediate assessment of German airborne capabilities. The resulting report, delivered on May 15th, was sobering. The Germans possessed at least several hundred gliders and trained glider pilots. They had parachute infantry divisions. They had demonstrated the ability to deliver troops behind enemy lines with precision. Most concerning, they had weapons, the shaped charges, that could defeat fortifications previously thought impregnable. The report concluded that Britain itself was vulnerable to similar attacks. Key points, bridges, ports, airfields could be seized by airborne assault. Dowding recommended immediate expansion of anti-aircraft defences and development of British airborne forces. Winston Churchill, who became Prime Minister on the very day Eben-Emael fell, read the intelligence reports with growing alarm. He immediately grasped the strategic implications. If the Germans could land troops anywhere, then no position was secure. Churchill ordered the creation of British airborne forces within days of taking office. He also ordered a comprehensive review of Britain's coastal defences. If Eben-Emael could fall from the sky, so could Dover Castle or any other fortification. But while the Allies scrambled to understand and counter the new German capabilities, the immediate tactical situation in Belgium was collapsing with stunning speed. The bridges captured by the glider troops at Vroonhoven and Veldwesselt became the arteries through which German armour poured into Belgium. The 4th Panzer Division, one of Germany's elite armoured formations, had been positioned immediately behind the border specifically to exploit the bridge seizures. When word came that the bridges were intact and in German hands, the panzers rolled forward. By 8 a.m. on May 10th, the first German tanks were crossing the Albert Canal. By noon, an entire panzer division was across. By evening, German armour was 20 miles inside Belgium, far deeper than any Belgian war plan had anticipated for the first day. The Belgian 7th Division, responsible for defending the canal line, found itself outflanked and encircled. German tanks were behind them while German infantry attacked from the front. The division disintegrated, some units surrendering, others retreating in disorder. The Belgian defensive line, which was supposed to hold for days, lasted less than 12 hours. The speed of the German advance created a cascading crisis for the Allies. The French First Army, moving north into Belgium, was advancing into what its commanders thought was a stable front. Instead, they were moving toward a breakthrough that was expanding by the hour. On May 11th, French cavalry units acting as the advance guard encountered German panzers near Hanout. The French expected to find Belgian forces holding the line and Germans probing forward cautiously. Instead, they found Belgian forces in retreat and German armour advancing in strength. The resulting clash was one of the first major tank battles of the campaign, but it was a meeting engagement that the French had not anticipated and were not prepared for. The British Expeditionary Force, landing at Channel ports and moving inland, received reports that made no strategic sense. The Germans were already across the Albert Canal. Eben-Emael had fallen. Belgian forces were in retreat. The entire timeline of the campaign had compressed. What was supposed to take weeks was happening in days. Lord Gort, commanding the BEF, later wrote that the fall of Eben-Emael was the moment he understood that this campaign would be unlike any previous war. The Germans had not simply attacked with superior numbers or better tactics. They had rewritten the rules of what was possible. The psychological impact on Belgian civilians was immediate and devastating. Eben-Emael had been a symbol of national strength. Belgian propaganda had described it as impregnable. Schoolchildren were taught that the fortress protected them. Its fall shattered the illusion of Belgian military capability. Refugees began fleeing toward France and the coast on May 10th, before most of Belgium was even threatened. The roads clogged with civilians, hampering military movements. The refugee crisis, which would eventually see millions of Belgians flee their homes, began with the news that Eben-Emael had fallen. If the greatest fortress could not protect them, what could? The German propaganda machine exploited the victory ruthlessly. Radio broadcasts trumpeted the fall of the fortress. Newspapers published photographs of the destroyed cupolas and captured garrison. Newsreels showed German troops standing atop Eben-Emael's ruins. The message was clear. German arms were invincible. Resistance was futile. The propaganda was directed not just at Belgium, but at France and Britain. If you continue to resist, the broadcast suggested, you will suffer Belgium's fate. Your fortresses will fall, your armies will be defeated. Surrender now and avoid further bloodshed. For neutral nations, particularly the United States, the fall of Eben-Emael was a wake-up call. American military observers in Europe sent urgent reports back to Washington. The Germans had demonstrated new capabilities that made existing fortification doctrine obsolete. The United States had invested heavily in coastal fortifications, assuming they would provide defense against invasion. If shaped charges and airborne assault could defeat the most modern European fortress, American coastal forts were equally vulnerable. The US Army immediately began studying shaped charge technology and airborne operations. Within months, American engineers were developing their own hollow charge weapons. Within a year, the US was forming airborne divisions. The lessons of Eben-Emael directly influenced American military development throughout the war. Soviet observers drew similar conclusions. The Red Army had invested enormous resources in the Stalin Line and other fortification systems. If the Germans could defeat Belgian fortresses so easily, Soviet fortifications were equally at risk. The Soviets began developing both shaped charge weapons and defences against airborne assault. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, both sides employed airborne operations and shaped charge weapons. The technology pioneered at Eben-Emael had become standard within a year. But while the world absorbed the strategic lessons, the immediate tactical situation in Belgium continued to deteriorate. By May 12th, 2 days after Eben-Emael's neutralisation, German forces had advanced over 40 miles into Belgium. The entire Belgian defensive strategy was in shambles. The French and British, moving to support Belgium, found themselves advancing into a trap. The German main effort was not in Belgium at all, but through the Ardennes forest to the south, where panzer divisions were driving toward the French frontier. The attack through Belgium, supported by the Eben-Emael operation, was a diversion. A successful diversion. The Allies had committed their best forces to Belgium, exactly as the Germans had hoped. While French armies moved north toward the sound of guns in Belgium, German armour was breaking through in the south, where French defences were weakest. By May 15th, German tanks had reached the Meuse River in France. By May 20th, they had reached the Channel coast, cutting off all Allied forces in Belgium and northern France. The pocket that resulted would culminate in the Dunkirk evacuation, one of the greatest military disasters in British history. The fall of Eben-Emael did not directly cause this catastrophe, but it enabled it. By collapsing Belgian defences so quickly, the glider assault ensured that Allied forces moved north into Belgium at maximum speed, leaving the Ardennes sector weakly defended. The German plan required the Allies to commit to Belgium. Eben-Emael guaranteed they would. On May 28th, 18 days after Eben-Emael fell, King Leopold surrendered the Belgian army. The campaign that was supposed to last months had lasted 18 days. The fortress that was supposed to hold indefinitely had lasted 30 hours. The defensive strategy that generations of Belgian officers had refined and perfected had collapsed in the time it takes to eat breakfast. The post-war analysis of Eben-Emael's fall focused initially on the technical aspects. How had the shaped charges worked so effectively? How had the gliders achieved surprise? How had such a small force accomplished so much? But the deeper analysis revealed more fundamental problems. The Belgians had built their fortress based on assumptions about warfare that were already obsolete. They assumed attacks would come from predictable directions using conventional methods. They prepared for the last war, not the next one. This criticism was arguably unfair. The Belgian military had designed Eben-Emael using the best available intelligence and the most modern engineering. The fortress was proof against any known weapon and any conventional assault method. The problem was not that Belgian engineers were incompetent, but that German engineers had developed weapons the Belgians did not know existed. The shaped charge technology was highly classified. German research into hollow charges had been conducted in secret. No Allied intelligence service knew the Germans had perfected practical military shaped charges until they were used at Eben-Emael. The Belgians could not defend against a threat they did not know existed. The same was true of the glider assault method. While gliders themselves were not secret, no military had attempted to use them in combat. The concept of landing troops directly on top of a fortress had been theorized but dismissed as impractical. The Germans had not only proven it practical, but had executed it flawlessly. The real lesson of Eben-Emael was not about Belgian incompetence or German superiority. It was about the nature of military innovation. Defenders, by definition, prepare for known threats. Attackers who succeed are those who develop unknown capabilities and employ them before defences can be developed. The Germans had achieved surprise not through deception about their intentions, but through innovation in their methods. This pattern would repeat throughout the war. The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor succeeded not because the Americans did not expect war with Japan, they did, but because the Japanese employed their carrier fleet in ways the Americans had not anticipated. The British commando raids on occupied Europe succeeded because the Germans had not prepared for small-scale amphibious assaults against coastal targets. The American island-hopping campaign in the Pacific succeeded because the Japanese had not developed doctrine for defending against it. In each case, innovation in methods enabled tactical success that strategic warning could not prevent. The technical legacy of Eben-Emael was profound. The shaped charge, proven effective in combat, became one of the most important weapons of World War II and beyond. Every major military developed hollow charge weapons. Anti-tank rifles and cannons, effective in early war, were rendered obsolete by shaped charge weapons that could defeat any armour. The Panzerfaust, issued to German infantry in huge numbers late in the war, allowed individual soldiers to destroy tanks. It was a direct descendant of the charges used at Eben-Emael, miniaturized and simplified but operating on the same principle. The American bazooka, issued in 1942, used a shaped charge warhead. Soviet anti-tank rifles were replaced by RPG launchers, again using shaped charges. By 1943, every army in the world had shaped charge weapons. The British developed the Piat, a spring-powered launcher firing shaped charge bombs. The Italians, Japanese, and even the Chinese developed various hollow charge weapons. The technology that had been a German secret in 1940 was universal by 1943. Modern anti-tank weapons, from the RPG-7 to the Javelin missile, all employ shaped charge warheads. The principle discovered in the 1880s, refined by German engineers in the 1930s, and proven at Eben-Emael, remains the basis for defeating armour. A century and a half after its discovery, the hollow charge remains one of the most effective weapons ever developed. The glider assault method, while less enduring, had immediate impact. The British formed their glider pilot regiment in 1942. American glider infantry trained at bases across the United States. By 1944, thousands of Allied glider troops were ready for combat. The D-Day invasion employed extensive glider forces. British gliders carried troops who captured the Pegasus Bridge over the Albert Canal, a mission directly modelled on the Eben-Emael operation. American gliders delivered troops and equipment throughout Normandy. At Arnhem during Operation Market Garden, British gliders landed an entire division behind German lines. While the operation ultimately failed, the glider assault itself succeeded technically. Hundreds of gliders landed thousands of troops exactly where planned. In the Pacific, American gliders were used for supply missions, delivering equipment to forward airstrips. In Burma, British gliders inserted entire brigades behind Japanese lines. The glider, dismissed as a novelty before Eben-Emael, became a standard weapon of war. The decline of gliders came not because they failed, but because they were superseded. As helicopter technology matured in the 1950s, powered rotorcraft could deliver troops with greater flexibility and safety than unpowered gliders. The last major combat use of gliders was during the Korean War, after which they were retired from military service. But for a crucial period from 1940 to 1950, gliders were a primary method of deploying airborne forces, and that use traced directly to the success at Eben-Emael. The human legacy of the operation was more mixed. Rudolf Witzig, lionized in German propaganda, continued to serve throughout the war. He commanded airborne units in Crete, in Russia, and in the West. He survived the war and lived until 2001, dying at the age of 85. In interviews late in his life, he spoke about Eben-Emael with a mixture of pride and regret. Pride in what his men had accomplished. Regret that the victory had served a cause he came to recognize as evil. When asked how he felt about enabling the German invasion of Western Europe, Witzig replied that he had been a soldier following orders, but that the orders had served a monstrous regime. His success at Eben-Emael had helped the Nazis conquer Belgium and France, leading to years of occupation, repression, and ultimately the Holocaust. No tactical brilliance could balance that moral weight. Several of the 78 men who assaulted Eben-Emael did not survive the war. Some were killed in Crete during the disastrous German airborne invasion of the island in 1941. Others died in Russia during the brutal Eastern Front campaigns. The German airborne forces, so successful in 1940, suffered catastrophic casualties in subsequent operations, as Allied forces developed countermeasures and anti-airborne tactics. On the Belgian side, the survivors of Eben-Emael's garrison carried the stigma of defeat for decades. In the immediate aftermath, some were accused of cowardice or incompetence. How could 200 men surrender to fewer than 100 attackers? The accusations were grossly unfair, but they reflected the shock and humiliation of Belgium's rapid defeat. Later analysis vindicated the Belgian defenders. They had fought as well as could be expected, against an enemy employing weapons and tactics they could not have anticipated. The shaped charges had neutralized their positions before they could respond effectively. The glider assault had put enemy troops inside their defensive perimeter from the first moment of combat. No amount of courage could compensate for the tactical surprise achieved by the Germans. Major Jotrand, the fortress commander who surrendered Eben-Emael, was initially court-martialed for capitulating too quickly. The charges were eventually dismissed when military investigators understood the circumstances of the battle. Jotrand had held out for over 30 hours with most of his fortress destroyed and his garrison under continuous attack. He had no hope of relief and no prospect of effective resistance. His surrender had saved his men's lives without changing the battle's outcome. He was quietly rehabilitated and lived the rest of his life in Belgium, dying in 1973. Frans Moonen, the Belgian sergeant who survived a shaped charge penetrating his casemate, became a teacher after the war. He spent decades researching what had happened at Eben-Emael, interviewing German veterans and studying technical reports. His book, published in 1975 in Flemish, provided one of the most detailed accounts of the battle from the Belgian perspective. In it, he argued that the fortress had not failed. It had been defeated by weapons that did not exist when it was designed. The fort had done what it was built to do, resist conventional attack. But the German attack had been anything but conventional. The broader questions raised by Eben-Emael continued to resonate long after the battle. How do military forces prepare for unknown threats? How do commanders balance the need for security with the flexibility to respond to innovation? The Belgian approach had been to build fixed fortifications based on known threats. This made sense given limited resources and the need to defend specific terrain. But it left them vulnerable to asymmetric attack. The German approach had been to invest in innovation, developing new weapons and tactics that would achieve surprise. This was more expensive and risky. It required research and development that might produce nothing useful. But when it succeeded, the payoff was enormous. The fall of Eben-Emael validated the German approach, at least in the short term. Innovation had defeated preparation. In the longer war, however, the balance shifted. The Allies, with greater resources and industrial capacity, proved more adaptable. They copied German innovations like shaped charges and airborne operations, then developed their own innovations like radar, code breaking, and the atomic bomb. By 1945, Allied technological superiority was overwhelming. The lesson was not that innovation always defeats preparation, but that sustained innovation requires resources that Germany, overextended and isolated, could not maintain. The immediate tactical success at Eben-Emael contributed to German strategic overconfidence. If a fortress could be taken so easily, what could not be accomplished? This overconfidence led to disastrous decisions like the airborne invasion of Crete, where German paratroopers suffered over 50% casualties, and the invasion of the Soviet Union, launched in the belief that German tactical superiority would overcome Soviet numerical superiority. Neither assumption proved correct. Modern military theorists still study Eben-Emael as a case study in asymmetric warfare. The battle demonstrates how small forces using innovative methods can achieve results far exceeding their size. It also demonstrates the limitations of fixed defences against thinking enemies. The fortification, no matter how strong, is only as effective as the assumptions built into its design. If those assumptions are wrong, the fortification becomes a liability rather than an asset. This lesson has obvious relevance to modern military planning. Nations still build fortifications, but the emphasis has shifted from passive defence to active response. Modern fortifications include not just thick walls but sensors, communications, and rapid reaction forces that can respond to threats as they develop. The goal is not to make a position impregnable, but to make it costly enough to attack that enemies seek alternative targets. Eben-Emael failed because it was both too strong and not strong enough. Too strong in that its apparent impregnability caused Belgian planners to rely on it completely. Not strong enough in that its defences could not cope with shaped charges and glider assault. A weaker but more flexible defence might have performed better by maintaining mobility and avoiding over-reliance on fixed positions. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Eben-Emael, shaped charges and glider assault, have modern descendants. Precision-guided munitions can now defeat any fortification from standoff range. Helicopter and V-22 Osprey can deliver troops to any location, just as gliders did but with greater speed and flexibility. Modern militaries do not rely on fortifications for defence. They rely on mobility, dispersion and rapid reaction. In that sense, the fall of Eben-Emael marked the beginning of the end for fortification as the primary method of defence, not because fortifications cannot be built strongly enough, but because no fortification can anticipate all possible methods of attack. The German success at Eben-Emael was complete militarily, but its legacy is complex. It demonstrated that innovation and audacity could overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles. It showed that small forces, properly equipped and led, could achieve results that large forces could not. It proved that the defence is always reactive, preparing for known threats, while the offence can be proactive, developing new methods that defences cannot anticipate. But it also showed the limits of tactical brilliance. The perfect execution of the Eben-Emael assault did not win the war for Germany. It won a battle, enabled an invasion, contributed to a campaign victory. But tactical success, no matter how brilliant, cannot compensate for strategic overreach or moral bankruptcy. Germany's tactical innovations in 1940 could not overcome the Allied advantages in resources, industry and ultimately will. The men who landed on Eben-Emael in gliders on that May morning achieved something extraordinary. Against enormous odds, they succeeded completely. They destroyed what was thought indestructible. They accomplished in minutes what was expected to take weeks. They demonstrated capabilities that changed military doctrine worldwide, but their success served a regime that would lead Germany to ruin and commit atrocities that stained human history. Technical brilliance in service of an evil cause remains evil, no matter how impressive the technical achievement. The ruins of Eben-Emael today stand as a monument not to Belgian failure or German success, but to the eternal truth that military power is always temporary. The impregnable fortress falls. The invincible army is defeated. The perfect weapon is countered. Nothing in war is permanent except the suffering of those caught in its machinery. The fortress that could not fall, fell. The gliders that could not succeed, succeeded. And 78 men accomplished what armies could not. The story remains remarkable 85 years later, a testament to what human ingenuity and courage can achieve, for good or ill, when applied to the ancient art of war.